Frencher sat alone with a hungry baby after his wife died, until a widow knocked with milk to spare. Witness this unbelievable, true inspired story right here on Whisper of the Past. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share where you're watching from. Let's get started. The Wyoming plains stretched endlessly beneath a wide gray sky, where the wind rolled like an ocean across the tall grasses and rattled against the weathered walls of a lonely ranch house. Inside that cabin, a single lantern burned, casting long shadows across rough-hewn wooden beams. The air smelled faintly of smoke from the fireplace, mixed with the dampness of rain outside. In the rocking chair near the hearth sat John Miller, a man of 35, whose life had always been defined by resilience. He had tamed wild horses, endured droughts that turned the earth to dust, and battled winter storms that threatened to freeze cattle in their tracks. But nothing, not the hardest years nor the worst storms, had ever left him as powerless as he felt now. Cradled against his chest was his newborn daughter, Emma. Her tiny face was pale, her lips trembling as faint cries escaped her. The sound pierced the silence, fragile and heartbreaking. John's wife, Mary, had passed away just 2 weeks earlier during childbirth, and though neighbors and the town preacher had offered their condolences, none of them stayed when the days turned into long nights of mourning. He was alone in that house now, with nothing but the cry of an infant and the weight of grief pressing against his chest. John had tried to be strong. He always had been. When storms ripped through his fences, he fixed them. When wild coyotes prowled too close to his herd, he chased them off. He believed that if a man worked hard enough, he could endure anything. But grief was different, and worse than grief was helplessness. He could not feed his child. He could not give her what she needed most. He had tried everything. In town, the general store sold powdered formula, but Emma turned her head away, her weak cries turning into exhausted whimpers. He had warmed cow's milk, diluted it, spooned it gently to her lips, but her body rejected it, coughing and crying until she fell silent again. He had even tried broth in desperation, but it only made her turn her face away. Each attempt ended in failure, and each failure drove the dread deeper into his heart. Nights were the hardest. When the sky outside turned black and the plains grew silent except for the wind, the cabin seemed more like a prison of sorrow. He sat in the rocking chair, the fire burning low, whispering to his child that he was trying, that he would not let her go. But her tiny body, fragile and hungry, told him time was running out. Her cheeks had grown thinner. Her eyes seemed duller. She cried less, and that frightened him most of all. On the 4th night after Mary's burial, the storm outside grew heavier. Rain tapped against the window panes, and the wind whistled through the cracks. John sat in the same chair, rocking slowly, staring at the fire as Emma whimpered faintly. His own body trembled with exhaustion. His beard was unshaven, his eyes hollowed by sleeplessness. He pressed his lips to his daughter's forehead, whispering words of comfort he barely believed himself. "Stay with me, little one," he murmured, his voice breaking. "I'll find a way." But in his heart a dark fear gnawed at him. He had buried Mary, and he could not bear the thought of burying their child too. The weight of it crushed him, and for the first time in years, he bowed his head and prayed, not for strength, not for courage, but for a miracle. It was then, just as the clock ticked past midnight, that a sound startled him. A knock echoed against the heavy wooden door. John froze. He thought at first it was the wind, some branch striking the wall. But then it came again, steady and clear. Someone was at the door. At this hour, in the middle of the storm, on the edge of the lonely plains, someone had come. John rose slowly, clutching the baby to his chest. He crossed the wooden floor, his boots heavy against the boards, and unlatched the door. When it swung open, the lantern light spilled across the porch, revealing a woman standing there with rain glistening on her shawl. She looked at him with gentle but sorrowful eyes, her hair braided over one shoulder, damp from the drizzle. "John," she said softly, almost as if she didn't want to break the silence of the night. It was Sarah Thompson, the widow who lived a mile down the dirt road. She was about 30, known in town for her quiet strength and kindness. She had lost her husband 2 years ago, and last year her infant son had died in his sleep. The grief had etched itself into her features, but there was something steady in her gaze, something that did not break even in sorrow. "I heard her crying," Sarah continued, glancing toward the baby in his arms. "Sound carries far in the storm." John tightened his hold on Emma, unsure what to say. He had always been polite to Sarah when their paths crossed in town, but he had never expected her at his door. His throat tightened, the words caught between pride and desperation. "She's hungry," Sarah said gently, her eyes glistening. She hesitated, then spoke again, her voice trembling but firm. "When I lost my son, my body never stopped producing milk. I still can. If you'll let me, I can help her." John's chest constricted. The offer struck him like a blow, humbling, intimate, and yet filled with mercy. He wanted to say no, to insist he could manage, that it wasn't her burden to carry. But when he looked down at Emma's pale face, at the way her tiny mouth opened weakly, as if searching for what he could not give, his pride dissolved. "Please," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Please, help her." Sarah stepped inside, the warmth of the fire lighting her features as she set her shawl on the chair. She reached out her arms, and John, his hands trembling, carefully passed Emma to her. The widow held the baby with a tenderness only a mother could know. She adjusted her shawl for privacy, then cradled the infant close. Within moments, Emma latched and began to feed. The sound was soft but steady, the rhythm of life returning. Emma's small body relaxed, her cries quieting into contentment. Her tiny hands rested against Sarah's chest, and her cheeks moved with effort as she nursed. For the first time in days, John did not hear hunger or despair in the room. He heard relief. He heard survival. He sank into the nearest chair, covering his face with his hands. His shoulders shook, though he made no sound. Tears burned his eyes and fell through his fingers. He had prayed for a miracle, and it had come in the form of a widow on his porch at midnight. When he finally lifted his head, Sarah was rocking Emma gently, humming softly as the baby continued to feed. The sight struck him with a force he could not describe. His daughter, who only hours ago had seemed to slip closer to death, now looked alive again. Her cheeks began to flush with color. Her tiny body pressed contently against the widow who had answered his prayer. John whispered, almost to himself, "Thank you, God." Sarah looked up, her expression tender but firm. "You don't have to thank me," she said. "This is what mothers do, even when they've lost their own." The fire crackled, the storm outside raged, but inside the cabin, for the first time in weeks, there was peace. John watched his daughter nurse, watched her life return, and felt a weight lift from his heart. He did not know what tomorrow would bring, but in that moment he knew one thing: he was not alone. The weeks after that night brought changes no one in town could have predicted. Thomas, once seen as a man destined to vanish into grief, found himself rising with new strength each morning. The widow who had arrived at his door, her name was Clara, became an unshakable part of his life and of the little cabin. She never demanded recognition or repayment. She simply showed up when she was needed most. She brought her presence, her gentleness, and the steady, unassuming strength of a woman who had already weathered her own storms. Thomas had lived his entire life with the understanding that ranching required toughness. You faced drought, bitter winters, or the loss of cattle, and you pushed forward. But nothing had prepared him for the weight of raising an infant alone. Every night he feared he might fail, that he could not replace the warmth his wife had left behind. But with Clara's help, the fear began to ease. The baby, named Samuel after Thomas's grandfather, began to thrive. His cries softened, his belly stayed full, and his tiny fists relaxed when Clara's arms wrapped around him. People in town began to notice the difference. When Thomas rode into town for supplies, Samuel cradled against his chest in a sling Clara had sewn from old fabric. The whispers followed him. Men at the feed store shook their heads in quiet respect. Women at the mercantile softened their eyes, speaking kinder words than before. They all saw that he was no longer a man broken by grief, but a father holding on, reshaped by the unlikely grace of a widow's arrival. Clara herself was no stranger to sideways glances. Whispers of her past followed her wherever she went. Her husband had been lost to a mine collapse 2 years earlier, and though she had no children of her own, the tragedy had carved her into someone who understood the weight of loss. She had carried her grief quietly, working odd jobs, keeping mostly to herself, until that night the storm pushed her toward Thomas's cabin. Some townsfolk, bound by their small-minded notions, judged her presence at his home. But Clara never allowed their murmurs to sway her. She had found a purpose again, one that stretched beyond her own loneliness. As autumn rolled into winter, the bond between Thomas, Clara, and the child deepened. Nights grew longer, the fireplace burned hotter, and together they learned to weave a rhythm of survival. Thomas tended to the ranch by day, hauling hay, mending fences, and caring for the horses, while Clara kept the baby close, singing lullabies in her soft voice. Sometimes Thomas would come in from the biting wind and pause at the door, watching the glow of firelight on Clara's hair as she rocked Samuel in her arms. In those quiet moments, he felt both gratitude and confusion stir inside him. He had never planned for this life, never imagined leaning on another woman so soon after burying his wife. Yet there Clara was, not demanding to be anything other than what she was, present, patient, and kind. But nothing in life remains without challenge. One evening, a letter arrived from Thomas's in-laws back east. His late wife's parents, stricken with their own grief, had heard whispers from neighbors that their daughter's child was being nursed and cared for by another woman. Though they had not seen Samuel since his birth, their anger came swiftly through pen and ink. They accused Thomas of disrespect, of replacing their daughter too soon, of allowing another woman to step into a role that should have been sacred. The words cut deep, reopening wounds Thomas thought were beginning to heal. He sat at the table with the letter clenched in his hands, staring into the fire while Clara folded laundry nearby. For the first time in months, silence stretched heavy between them. Clara sensed the storm brewing inside him, though he said nothing at first. At last, she set the basket aside and asked what was troubling him. When he showed her the letter, his voice cracked. "They think I've forgotten her. They think I'm dishonoring her memory, but you saved us." Clara's heart ached at his words. She knew this role was never about replacing another woman. She had only sought to help a child in need and a man drowning under sorrow. She reached across the table, her hand brushing against his knuckles. "Thomas," she said softly, "you have not forgotten her. Every breath of this little one carries her memory. What we do here, what I do, it's not to take her place. It's to help you carry what she left behind." Though her words soothed him, the shadow of that letter lingered. For days, Thomas felt himself torn between guilt and gratitude. He feared that leaning too much on Clara might erase the love he once shared with his wife. Yet each time Samuel reached out for Clara, each time his cries stilled in her embrace, the truth became clearer. This was not about forgetting. It was about surviving, and survival often required unexpected grace. Winter storms grew harsher, trapping them in the cabin for days at a time. Snow piled high against the walls, the wind howled through the valley, and firewood dwindled faster than Thomas had planned. It was during one such storm that Samuel fell ill, his tiny chest rattling with each breath. Panic seized Thomas as memories of loss threatened to consume him once more. He held his son close, pacing the cabin, whispering desperate prayers, while Clara brewed every remedy she knew from her mother's teachings. She stayed awake by the fire, wiping the baby's forehead, coaxing drops of broth between his lips, refusing to let fear overtake her. For 3 nights they battled the fever together. On the 4th morning, Samuel's breathing steadied and color returned to his cheeks. Exhausted but relieved, Thomas found Clara asleep in the rocking chair, the baby nestled safely in her arms. In that moment, he realized he owed more than words could ever repay. She had not only saved his child's life, but also saved his heart from crumbling completely. By spring, the snow melted, and the ranch awakened with new life. Calves were born, the earth softened, and the valley bloomed with wildflowers. With the change of season came a change in Thomas as well. No longer did he carry grief like a burden he could not put down. Instead, he carried it like a memory etched into the soil of his soul, one that grew alongside new beginnings. Clara remained by his side, no longer just the widow who had once knocked on his door, but a trusted partner in the quiet, daily work of keeping a family alive. Though the whispers of townsfolk and the judgment of distant in-laws never fully ceased, Thomas learned to let their voices fade. He had once believed that strength meant standing alone, but Clara had taught him that true strength was often found in allowing someone else to stand with you. Their bond was not forged from convenience or scandal, but from necessity, compassion, and the undeniable pull of shared humanity. In the evenings, when the sun dipped behind the hills and the sky burned gold, Thomas often found himself seated on the porch with Samuel in his lap and Clara nearby. The baby would laugh, reaching for Clara's hands, and Thomas would feel a warmth settle in his chest that he had once thought impossible to feel again. It was not the same as the love he had lost, nor was it meant to be. It was something new, something born of survival and mercy, a reminder that life, even in its harshest seasons, could still offer moments of unexpected grace. As time went on, their story became a quiet legend in the valley. Neighbors spoke less of scandal and more of resilience. They saw a man who had endured unbearable loss, a child who had nearly been starved of comfort, and a woman who had stepped forward when no one else dared. Together, they had rewritten what family could mean, not bound by convention, but by the unshakable truth that love often arrived in forms we never expected. And so the rancher who once sat alone with a hungry baby, shattered by grief, came to understand that sometimes salvation does not come with grand gestures or perfect timing. Sometimes it arrives in the form of a widow's knock at the door, carrying nothing more than milk to spare, and a heart strong enough to help carry the weight of another's sorrow.